Thanks so much for having me to this meeting. It's fun to be here. I was reflecting back on this topic and working on this topic. The first paper I ever published was on whether global changes will increase the success of biological invaders, and it was 25 years ago. I realized thinking back on this, and so it's fun to think about, well, what's happened in the last 25 years? And we've come a long way. A lot has happened. And so I had that sort of time of reflection, and then also thought about, oh, shoot, let's see. I don't want to present the same talk I presented at the last version sort of this meeting in 2016, 8 years ago. How much have we done in the last 8 years? Didn't know how many people from that meeting were going to be in the room today. I thought, oh,
just enough to keep you.
Exactly. Yes. So I felt like I had to be, bring the latest. But then also in thinking about, well, some people are maybe, have not been working on this topic in some capacity for the last 25 years and don't think about this all the time. And so, if we're going to build something from this meeting, what do we have to build on? And well, I sort of realized we've got a lot to build on. This is just a sampling of some of the projects I've been involved in. There's back in 2008, the EPA sort of commissioned a report on this topic that came out as a special section in conservation biology with several different papers looking at this broader topic, including a paper on policy opportunities. Shown here. There was a small effort that was published in a special issue in the Canadian Journal of Forest Research in 2009, where one paper in particular focused on responses of insect pests, pathogens, and invasive plant species to climate change in Northeastern North America. Lou Zisk and I have written a book and edited another book on this general topic, and recently Karen wrote a chapter for one of those, and that book was recently updated with the 2022 edition that I stepped back from, but Lou edited himself. So whole books on this topic. There's a book, a Forest Service book that came out a few years ago now. It had one chapter in particular, but also parts of others that sort of looked at this topic in general. So there's a lot to draw on here, I guess, is all I'm saying when we're thinking about this. And then, even since then, a lot of things have happened. And so I tried to think about some of the categories of advances that have been made, and a lot of the advances that have been made have been really fun and impressive advances in mapping occurrence and abundance, which we've already heard about. And a lot of it's coming from Bethany Bradley, Janet Allen, and that group and others. And I didn't want to cover that stuff again. I knew you would have heard about that some in this meeting, but I'll mention that a lot of that progress is built on the synthesis of observational data sets into larger databases that we've been able to take advantage of. And it's fun. We can sort of look at invasions within the US with a perspective that we could not have gotten 8 years ago today. And so one example of that here is just looking at non-native plant species richness in plots sampled on the ground in a variety of different networks. So in this map, the darker orange plots have higher non-native plant species richness. This is a view we certainly didn't have 8 years ago, and it's fun to see that. This is assembling many different types of observations from different government agencies and other organizations. There's also the FIA plots that we could look at. So if we want to just look at forests, This is a data set that was published by Basil Iannone and colleagues. So looking at non-native plant species richness purely in FIA forest plots. So we can see these broad patterns of species richness. And in the FIA data, you can also look at prevalence, like how frequently do you see non-native species in these different FIA plots? And you see that, well, let me back up. Well, we see richness, bits of richness sort of everywhere or nearly everywhere in the US. There are lots of invasive species all over the place. They're primarily prevalent in forests, at least in the eastern US. But that's not necessarily meaning that's the only place where they're dominant. There are other ecosystems than forests, and of course, if we look more broadly, going back to this previous data set, you can see that if we look at non-native plant cover across the US in many different ecosystem types, here we have different locations, but you see that some of the highest cover is in the western US, where we have things like cheatgrass monocultures, essentially in the Great Basin. So anyway, the point here is we can have this broader view of what's going on in the country than we could have 10, 15 years ago, which is fun and useful. We're also starting to take advantage of things like herbarium databases. And so this is now, I'm just going to show you a little bit of work from my lab, where Haley Flickinger, a graduate student, has been collecting tiny samples off herbarium sheets from the sort of extra material that falls off of plant samples, and she's been analyzing that. So she's collected plant samples from the different sort of spatial locations that are shown here on the map, and through different times of collection going back to the 1860s, I believe. And she's looked at 6 different species, and she's able to take data from that sort of database and analyze the plant material for nitrogen concentration, for instance. And she can see across 6 species, there's been this consistent decrease in nitrogen concentration over time, an increase in carbon to nitrogen ratio. So here in this panel, if it's a little hard to see, the top column is looking at the concentration in nitrogen over time as plotted against the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere in those locations. And we see this consistent decrease across different species. Well, it's not totally consistent across species, but they're all decreasing in nitrogen concentration over time by approximately 20%, really, over the length of this record. So anyway, I think over time we've been able to sort of take advantage of broader perspective and larger data sets and see some of these big patterns. So that has been that's been one fun change over this period to witness, and that's really helped with our ability to do occurrence modeling and abundance modeling as we've been assembling more of these data sets. One thing I'll note that we're still, in a way, relatively early in the process of assembling these data sets, so there are not too many plots that have been resampled when you look across the US. And so that makes it harder to say what the trend is in any given location. We can say what the status is, but it's going to be a while before we have a rich enough data set to say what the trends are in different locations, let alone to attribute them to different factors in those different locations. We've also had a bunch of progress in the realm of manipulative experiments. So manipulative experiments in this case being where you're manipulating, say, a climate variable or the presence of an invader and looking at the impact of those different factors. And so there have been many studies that have been looking at the responses of native species to an environmental change and comparing those to the responses of an invasive species. So that potentially gets at what the impacts of a global change could be on the establishment of invasive species in different places. And there have also been more and more studies looking at the effects of invasives on native species and trying to understand how they change when you put that in an environmental change context. So in a warmer environment, are the invasives more problem or more harmful essentially to the natives, or in a higher CO2 environment, that sort of thing. And so that's allowed us to then start doing things like meta-analyses. Here's one that was published in 2017, and looking here at the responses of native species in blue and invasive species in red to different factors. And so, for instance, at the top here, we see that both native and invasive species, on average across about 25 to 30 studies, responded positively to increased nitrogen, not too surprising. And the invasive species responded marginally more positively, which is also not too surprising given that we've also seen in this time period that invasive species tend to have traits that are more linked to resource acquisition or rapid resource acquisition. And so it shouldn't be that surprising that they'd be good at taking advantage of increasing nitrogen amounts. And one of the reasons that these studies focus on elevated nitrogen conditions are that we're increasing nitrogen deposition rates across especially the more developed areas of the world. And we don't talk about that too much necessarily in conjunction with climate change, but it is an important environmental change that we're seeing in many regions. And we're trying to control that with various pollution control measures, but it's still sort of unavoidable, and particularly in farming regions where you're having volatilization of nitrogen off the farm fields at some times. We may be able to control it more out of things like coal-fired power plants that are rapidly decreasing across the landscape. All right. Other changes that we see from this meta-analysis are that invasive species have been, on average, more responsive to elevated CO2 than native species. And I saw that in particular in a project that I did in California looking at yellow star thistle, which was incredibly responsive to elevated CO2 compared to the resident species in California grasslands. But this is a consistent pattern across 45, 46 studies here. And on average, invasive species have been more responsive to warmer temperatures than native species. Not very strong evidence one way or another for changes in precipitation, although it seems that invasive species were a little more disadvantaged by drought than native species. Okay, so there are more manipulative experiments that we can analyze now, and we can reasonably do meta-analyses of these sorts of things and look at trends. That's one change we've seen in the last 8 years since the last meeting, I would say. We can also look at impacts of invasion, and the next couple slides are from a project that was mainly looking at effects of biodiversity change. And so on the left-hand side of these graphs, you'll see what's the effect of biodiversity loss on, in this case, productivity of the system as you lose increasing amounts of biodiversity. But it also compares the effect of biodiversity loss to different global changes, including the effective introduction of an invasive species, which is shown here where the orange arrow is pointing. And so what you see here is that on average, across this study, introducing an invasive species to an ecosystem tended to increase, invasive plant species tended to increase productivity of that system more than many other global change treatments. And one difficult I'd say, issue with doing meta-analyses on these sorts of studies is that people have to arbitrarily pick an amount of warming or an amount of CO2 or an amount of nitrogen to add in these studies. And so saying the effect of an invasive species is greater than or less than the effect of this global change treatment is compared to whatever the arbitrary choices of the investigators were in the first place and the levels of these treatments. But anyway, the point here is we know invasive species make a real impact on productivity. And you can also compare this to decomposition. Here we see that invasive species basically have the strongest effect in accelerating decomposition when introduced to ecosystems. And so this maybe shouldn't be so surprising. If I already mentioned that invasive species tend to have these resource acquisitive traits. These are things like thin leaves, nitrogen-rich leaves in some cases, and things that that end up being linked with fast decomposition in the first place and faster nutrient cycling in systems. Okay, we've also been able to do some meta-analyses of the impacts of weeds on crops. So now we're narrowing this down to crop systems, which is maybe a little bit outside my purview for this talk. Forgive me, but this was research that I was involved in, and I think it parallels some other work that I'll talk about. So this is from a meta-analysis that Monsivia did along with some others of us, and here she was looking at the effects of different global change treatments on weeds alone, and then the effects of global changes on. Sorry, let me back up. She was looking at the effect of different global changes on crops, crop production, or crop performance in some way, and looking at studies that looked at the effect of a global change on that crop performance, looked at the effect of a weed on that crop performance, and then looked at the combined effects of both, and looking at whether the effect of the weed on crop performance was changed by the environmental change treatment. And so here we're looking at the effect of elevated CO2 overall. And so first, if in these studies that looked at elevated CO2, if they, under control conditions, if they just looked at the effect of the weeds on crop performance, in the top circle here, you see that weeds alone had a negative effect on crop performance. Global change alone, elevated CO2, in this case, tended to increase crop performance. And then if we, oops, I didn't make it forward that much. Well, we'll see. Anyway, if we look at the bottom, at the bottom point here, we see that the effect of weeds on crop performance under global change was basically the same as the effect of weeds alone in the control condition. So global change didn't alter the effect of weeds in this case. In the case of drought, this on the right-hand panel here, you see that drought reduced crop performance. Well, sorry, weeds on the top reduced crop performance, drought in the middle there reduced crop performance, and the effect of weeds under drought was really no different than the effect of weeds alone. There we go. And then if we look at the effect of warming, sort of similar message. Warming didn't really have much effect on its own. Weeds, of course, had a negative effect, and the result of weeds, or the impact of weeds under warming, was really not distinguishable from the effect of weeds in the control conditions. And Jenica co-led a paper that tried to do the same thing more broadly, or really primarily outside of crop systems, looking at the effect of invasions and whether they were sort of interacting synergistically with global changes or not. And the message was, I mean, it's a little complicated. So looking across a whole bunch of different studies here, and different types of global changes. The effects of the global changes tended to be negative on performance of other species. The effect of the invasive species were negative, and the effect of the invasive species under environmental change, on average, tended to not be that different than their effects with the global. Than their effects without the global change. But the bar here, the multicolored bar here, shows sort of a proportion of interactions that were additive in the gray versus sub-additive in the lighter shades versus synergistic, which you might think of as being sort of surprising, like maybe more of an effect than you would expect or much less of an effect than you would expect. Those are in the darker colored sort of ends of this distribution here. So really what you see is that that for the most part, the responses of other species or sort of system responses to weeds plus or invasive species plus global change were what you'd expect, or maybe less than you'd expect from the combination of the two. But there were still about a quarter of the cases where we observed these sort of surprising responses that were synergistic in some way. So I think the message is a little bit complicated here, just in that you usually might get what you expect, or things aren't worse than you would expect, at least. But sometimes, in a substantial fraction of the cases, things are actually, that you are getting some sort of more multiplicative effect between the invasive species effect and the global change. And this study breaks this down in much more detail, and I'll just go into it a little bit briefly here. So if we just look at plant invasions on the top here, then you can see that the effects of global changes on average were negative. The effect of plant invasions on average were even more negative. And the effect of the invasion and global change together were approximately additive, but sort of more negative than the two on their own. And in the case of animal invasions, this was a bit of a different story. So there's a lot of nuance in this paper, and if you're interested in the details, you can go into it and break things down. Here's just one panel from the supplement, where, among other things, you see that drought was one of the factors that actually had synergistic effects. So that is that across this data set, on average, if you had an invasive species under drought conditions, its effect was worse than you would have expected, just based on either the drought or the invasive species alone. So there seems to be a surprising synergistic effect when you combine invasive species and drought, as opposed to all these other sets of conditions. You don't see that to the same extent. So, if we trying to summarize across the recent advances in manipulative experiments, we see that there are, in some cases, these synergistic effects. They're not super common, but they can be important. But out of all of these studies that were summarized in these meta-analyses, there are still relatively few that have been done in field settings with realistic competition. I would say these meta-analyses still summarize, for the most part, a lot of studies that are done in pots or with individual species, or that are sort of making things a bit more simple than the reality of the messy field, and understanding whether those responses are going to be replicated in real conditions is still a little questionable, I think. Okay, here's an older figure from Dana Blumenthal and Cray, that sort of tries to summarize the different options that we have for dealing with invasive species or weeds under different environmental changes in the future. So what we're looking at here, this first slide shows an agricultural system where we have different global changes on the top affecting a fast-growing invasive species or a weed, basically, and also affecting a fast-growing crop here of some sort. And so different environmental changes are going to have different effects. So CO2 is generally going to have a positive effect on both the weed and the crop. Temperature, it depends on the weed and it depends on the crop and where you are. Same with precipitation. Extreme events are generally not going to favor crops, but they can favor weeds in some cases. But if you think about, well, what are the management options you have in the agricultural system? You have, among other things, you have the ability to choose what crop you plant in a given location in a given year for annual crops in particular. You've got artificial selection going on. You've got different genotypes at your disposal you can potentially use that may deal with these different environmental changes in different ways. So you have some control over trying to maximize your competitive ability of your crop versus your weed. On the other hand, the weeds are fighting back with strong dispersal ability, typically broad tolerance to different environments. So they're more likely to do well anywhere than maybe a lot of the crop varieties that are out there. They have many different species, so there's the ability to shift their communities. Different species may be sort of problematic in different locations, and in a given year, it may be that if you've got 7 different species or 20 different species, some of them might do just fine in any given year, whereas your crop, you're stuck with the one that you're trying to, in most systems at least, that you're trying to facilitate. And then, of course, the weeds, since they're annuals and they're just out there in the environment, they can evolve rapidly to the changing conditions, whereas the crops were typically sort of relying on the breeders and genetic engineers to do that evolution for us at this point. So this is sort of the management context that we have under global change in the agricultural system. The natural system's a little bit, it's similar for the most part, but you have fast-growing invasive species competing with often slow-growing native species. So they may not be as competitive, some of these native species. And here, you're not planting in those native species on an annual basis. You're relying on the natural community shifts to hopefully maximize the competitive ability of the community on its own, sort of slow selection for the species that are best adapted. And potentially you're relying on assisted migration as we increasingly decide what species we want to move around and plant in natural context, what genotypes we want to try to preserve. So anyway, I think this is a useful sort of thought framework for how we deal with communities in a changing climate and the threat of invasive species. So I'll summarize with just a few thoughts. I think we've learned a lot in the last 25 years, but this is a really complex problem. There's a lot going on here. And in many cases, we need to think sort of case by case what the solutions are for a given ecosystem, a given species we're trying to manage for. What is the resource we're trying to conserve? What are the ecosystem services we might want to preserve in a given location? I think the managements can be very site specific often. The messages for management and for policy haven't really changed much, I would say, in the last 25 years or 15 years at least, in terms of what we need to be thinking about, what we need to be doing. We have a lot more tools than we used to, a lot more fancy, flashy, fun tools, especially for thinking about where invasive species are likely to move and succeed going forward. But really still, when it comes to science and policy and management, I think in this area, a lot of our success is based on better communication and better data sharing. I think we are getting better at all of that. But if we want to develop the right policy, manage for the right species, use the right management techniques, I really think we, in many cases, need to be talking to our neighbors, talking to people in other geographies, thinking about what's moving around, how's it doing in what locations. and just learning from the experience of others. So yeah, that's what I've got. Happy to talk about more of this in questions or offline if you want. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Jim Stack shot his hand up in the air first.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, your comment about, the need for observational continuity. And I'm struggling to remember the paper, but I read at least one paper where they were comparing experimental to observational. And the conclusion of that paper was that experimental analysis of, when you're running experiments, controlling temperature, controlling temperature, they dramatically underestimate the impacts that we realize when we're looking at observational data.
Yeah, was it about drought, this paper?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was involved in that paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I remember it. How do we address that? I mean, so is it that we lack the sites to do that work, or we lack the resource to have humans actually do it? Meaning, how would we, where would we set this up? How do we set up the continuity?
I mean, I think the observational data is going to come with time. We could certainly have, in the FIA program, for instance, they do revisit sites now, and we will have more and more data coming in that look at periodic intervals. One of the things we can pluck out of that is the abundance of invasive species in those sites. So with time and with support of some of these monitoring programs, we will accumulate some of this data. The discrepancy between experiments and observations is tough to really deal with, and just that you have artifacts from experiments. It's hard to actually replicate a drought in many ways. Like, even if you prevent the rain from coming into the plot, that doesn't mean that it's not a humid and cloudy day, whereas in a drought you'd have maybe a hot and dry day instead. And so that's tough to deal with. But I think that you can still get at some things from experiments in ways that you can't with observations, and they're still useful. But I think in terms of just building those data sets, time and consistent funding support for the monitoring programs will be a huge help going forward, and continuing to network the observational programs that exist. And in some cases, I think there's real patchiness among like state level programs in terms of how much monitoring they do, how much information they pull in. Some states like Illinois do an amazing job of surveying the vegetation on a regular basis and reporting that. And other states basically don't do it at all. And so, networking things together where we can, and keeping the support for the programs that are doing good work, I think is important. Yeah.
So Jeff, just a question on the data sets that you referred to. Did these include satellite imagery? And if not, or in areas where data may not have been reported, can you go back and use satellite imagery to get that additional information?
I love that question. I thought about putting something about remote sensing imagery in here, and I didn't. This is there are some studies that are using remote sensing, rarely satellite imagery, typically lower altitude remote sensing, to try to pull out invasive species signatures. And so you can do that with some species to some extent, like cheatgrass. And there's a study that looked at that looked at this in Hawaii, and you can increasingly also get it like understory shrub invaders in the eastern US. But it's that's something that I wouldn't say that's been a consistently broadly useful advance over the last several years, but I think it's coming as we get sort of finer resolution remote sensing data and more consistent, repeatable remote sensing data. So it can be tough. I mean, it depends on the invasive species too. Some species are really hard to distinguish, and others are easy because they have different phenologies. I mean, that's typically what you're going to be able to find something with. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think it's like it's coming. It's not there yet, and it won't be there for everything.
So Jeff, in those last couple slides you talked about, you spoke about the weeds and you specifically referred to annual weeds.
Yeah.
Any information you can apply to perennials?
Um, well, I mean, I think that a lot of the same, they're just slower. I think a lot of the same principles apply. They still tend to be sort of faster, more resource acquisitive species on average. And yeah, I think, I don't know.
It's just the biology seems different. I think about, certainly you're dealing with foxtails popping up really quickly, but you wander through a patch of Canada thistle and the resource drain is very different in that perennial system, that mass of plants. And
Yeah,
they're coming up slower, but they're drawing different resources away from the crop.
yeah, for sure. And they also, they're different management challenges, and that's one of the species where glyphosate, for instance, is less potent under elevated CO2. And but I wish I had a great, like, here's my universal answer for perennials.
Well, that's okay.
But
Marty's gonna answer that.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, great.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, it seems like at least in our crop production systems, I can speak on natural areas, but crop production systems, those perennial weeds tend to dominate certain types of management systems. For instance, organic production. So there's
That's great foreshadowing for a question I'm gonna ask later.
yeah, okay.
I'm curious, and I'm kind of ignorant because I argue with my husband all the time is when does this stop being an invasive species? It's been here for 100 years. So my question is, when do you see much hybridization between invasive species and natural species? And what is that doing to our ecosystems?
Yeah, there's some species that have been studied for that, and I don't know that I can sum up easily what, I mean, it's changing the genotypes of it's making things more complicated. I guess that's my answer,
Probably making
right?
them more rugged.
It's yeah, potentially. And then what do you like? Is it still native if it's hybridized?
Yeah.
Probably not. And
But
that's
the control strategies become even harder. I
Yeah.
can imagine.
yeah. So it's not super common, but it certainly is occurring in some species. And yeah, I think it's annoying and complicated. Yes. I don't have a perfect answer for that. Sorry.
We don't know.
Yeah.
To make note of that, the ecologist says it's complicated.
Yeah.
The economist says it depends.
Yeah.